This week on the Communicators, FCC Commissioner Robert McDowell. The commissioner spoke about the state of the transition to digital television, the government's role and how Internet providers send information over their networks, and how the FCC might be affected by a new administration.
Robert McDowell is one of 5 Federal Communications Commission commissioners, one of 3 of the Republicans on the commission, and he is our guest this week on the Communicators. Commissioner McDowell, thank you for being with us.
Well, good morning. Thanks for having me again.
Ted Hearn of Multichannel News is here to join us in the questioning. If we could start, though, Commissioner, with what happened just recently in Wilmington, North Carolina, the test digital transition. Did it work?
Absolutely. Today is a historic day. We're taping this, of course, on the morning of September the 9th. So yesterday, September the 8th at noon, Wilmington, North Carolina became the first television market in the country to go all digital with its major stations there. And we're still getting reports from Wilmington. This is a test market for us. So kind of regardless of what happened, it was going to be a big success because we're going to learn from it. And that was the whole point, to have this 5 months out from the hard date of February 17th, 2009. So a few lessons we've learned already, if you'll allow me a minute or so to talk about this, which is the converter boxes that folks will need. They need to sign up early. Now, just to give a quick primer, starting midnight, February 17th, 2009, all TV stations, full-power TV stations in the country will have to go to digital. So for your viewers who may have a TV set in the house that's not hooked up to cable or to satellite, they should get a converter box. When Congress set this transition up, they set up a subsidy program for those converter boxes. So folks can apply for a coupon. I brought a prop. I hope I'm not violating the C-SPAN rules here, but this is a converter box coupon, which Peter's holding up for you right now to take a look at, and you can apply for that. The government is allowed for 2 per household. And there are a couple of phone numbers and websites I'd like to give right off the bat, because we're in the middle of a nationwide consumer awareness blitz here from the FCC to all across the country, really. But you can call 1-888-DTV-2009. That's 1-888-388-2009. And you can also go to www.dtv2009.gov.
When you call that number or go to that website, what do you say? Who do you talk to?
You're going to probably get an automated response from the phone number, and you're applying for the converter box coupon. Now, you don't need a coupon. You can go buy these boxes just completely out of your own pocket. I think it's important for folks to understand that. And we want folks to act as soon as possible. Act today, and that's one of the reasons.
You say you learned that from Wilmington. How did the converter boxes not work?
Well, they are working. It's just that folks think they had to wait until the actual transition deadline of noon yesterday to hook up their box. So we're getting TV stations and some college students who volunteer all getting phone calls, mainly from folks who are a little bit confused. Sometimes some senior citizens who aren't quite sure how to screw the box in correctly. And they're very simple boxes. And so the lesson there is hook up your box now, because broadcasters are broadcasting in digital today, and it's going to give you a sharper picture, better sound, and actually more channels to choose from, because broadcasters can use their new spectrum to broadcast multiple signals from the same broadcaster. So you can get more channels over the air for free and a better picture and better sound. So do it today, so you don't have to worry about things being scrambled up for you on February 17th. You also want to make sure the retailer that might be selling you the box has plenty in stock. And that's another concern we have, is there was a large retailer in the Wilmington area that actually ran out of boxes over the weekend. They got some more shipment in yesterday, supposedly. I was just up in Alaska 2 weeks ago as part of the FCC's Consumer Awareness Campaign. And actually Fairbanks, Alaska has the highest percentage of over-the-air only households, in other words, households that don't have satellite or cable. And the concern in Anchorage and in Fairbanks was that retailers were sometimes running out of these boxes. So,
Commissioner,
yes.
Are you confident that the February 17th, 2009 transition date will go smoothly based on what happened in Wilmington yesterday?
Well, I think the important thing to remember is what we're using Wilmington as a lesson. We'll try to learn from that to improve consumer awareness. It looks like consumers are very aware. We've gone from sort of 0% awareness to maybe 80 plus, almost 90% awareness of the DTV transition today by the general public.
Nationwide?
Nationwide. And I think one of the lessons from Wilmington is to make sure the airwaves are saturated with public service announcements. And so many kudos to the broadcasters, who of course have the most to lose throughout all this, and to the cable industry for saturating the airwaves or the cable channels with public service announcements. So there's a big blitz. I would like folks to be just as sick of digital TV public service announcements by February 17th as they are going to be of political ads by November the 4th. So if you're sick of seeing them, that's actually a very good sign.
So is the point if after February 17th, 2009, consumers find they don't have over-the-air television, they will have gotten enough messages prior to that date that they will know what to do?
That's what we're hoping, and that's one reason we had the Wilmington test, was to help raise awareness. It's getting a lot of press coverage. We're talking about it today. And also Chairman Martin, the chairman of the FCC, on August 18th announced a nationwide blitz of where we're targeting 81 out of the 210 markets for special attention. They might have a higher percentage of over-the-air only viewers, or just a large population like New York or Boston or LA of over-the-air viewers. So we're going out, either FCC staff and or the commissioners themselves are going out to these markets. I'm going out later this week to Tulsa. I was busy working the 2 markets in Alaska 2 weeks ago.
Do you see further tests?
Test markets. Well, Wilmington is the only market that volunteered to actually switch over. So this is a test, but also it's a permanent switchover for them already, an early switchover. We have seen other markets do sort of what I'll call a soft test, where for a few minutes they'll turn off their analog signals and send messages over those analog signals saying, if you're reading this message, you need to go buy a converter box. I think Reno, Nevada might have been the first market to do that. I'm strongly encouraging the broadcasters in each market I visit to try to do something like that. It generates a lot of local press coverage, heightens awareness, and is a fairly risk-free way of getting the job done. So we want to encourage more of that to happen. But so far, in terms of a real hard switchover, this is the only one, because Wilmington's the only market that volunteered.
Commissioner, cable operators and satellite TV providers are concerned that as the February 17th, 2000 date approaches, TV stations will pull their signals. There's an idea out there for a quiet period. Do you endorse the quiet period?
And I think, just for the folks watching at home, need to understand that there are 2 ways that broadcast stations get on cable networks. There's a mechanism called retransmission consent, which is a privately negotiated arrangement between broadcasters and the local cable operators, and there's must carry, which is a statutory provision that says that the cable operators must carry TV signals if negotiations can't be reached under retransmission consent. A lot of these retransmission consent deadlines expire on December 31st. So there is a concern, I guess, among cable operators that there might be a lot of confusion, and this might give broadcasters the upper hand in terms of these negotiations. Other points in time that give broadcasters maybe the upper hand in negotiations are the Super Bowl, which happens before the DTV transition. So that tends to be, we tend to find that a lot of these agreements are inked right before the Super Bowl and other big events like that. So as I understand it right now, broadcasters and cable are trying to work through their own quiet period of, let's say, early February to early March, where signals can't be pulled or threaten to be pulled during that time, to try to ensure a smooth DTV transition. And I would prefer for the private sector to try to reach an accommodation in that regard if possible.
If we could switch other topics while you're
Sure.
here, we'd like to take advantage of that. 7th anniversary of 9/11 coming up. Recently proposed sale of the emergency spectrum, the D block auction. What is the status of that? It hasn't been able to raise the capital necessary, correct?
Right. So again, just a quick review for folks watching at home. The broadcast, part of the broadcast spectrum by act of Congress, we auctioned off earlier this year as we move broadcasters from analog to digital. Analog takes, let's say this much of the airwaves to broadcast a signal. Digital takes this much, and you can put a lot more through that tiny amount. So that left a lot of leftover spectrum. So we auctioned it off. It's wonderful spectrum. Signals over that spectrum can go a long distance and can penetrate buildings and carry a lot of data, a lot of bandwidth, a lot of throughput, as engineers like to call it. So it's fantastic spectrum, and a lot of fantastic private sector uses that we can't even imagine right now, but also, as you point out, public safety and homeland security uses as well. After 9/11, in particular, it became apparent that we needed to have a nationwide interoperable public safety network. So as part of that, well, actually rewinding the tape here a little bit, in 1997, well before 9/11, Congress actually allocated to public safety 24 megahertz as a measurement of how much spectrum, 24 megahertz worth of this wonderful spectrum to public safety for use by them. But did not allow for any sort of funding mechanism to build out a nationwide network. Remember, there are 7+ or more thousand local jurisdictions, police chiefs, fire chiefs all over the country, and they don't have the money to buy the equipment or build this out themselves. So how is it going to be accomplished? So that was set up in 1997 before the Digital Television Act actually was enacted or signed into law in early '06. So at that point, then, Congress set up the mechanism for clearing those airwaves through this transition that we're talking about on February 17th, 2009. So those airwaves won't even be available until after February 17th. The FCC, and to the chairman's credit, allocated an additional 10 megahertz. Congress didn't tell us we had to do this, but trying to find a creative public-private partnership mechanism to get that built out. So could we get the adjoining 10 megahertz, an extra 10 megahertz on top of that 24 megahertz of spectrum, to somehow auction that off to a private entity to then give a total of 34 megahertz for public safety use nationwide. We offered that up with a fairly high reserve price, of a minimum price basically of $1.3 billion, and a lot of restrictions that were just too onerous for a bidder. So the auction, and that part of the auction failed. So we're back to the drawing board. The chairman has just put forth, as of last Thursday night, a new proposal to try to auction that off. We're reading through it. It's complicated.
What's your initial reaction?
My initial reaction is we have to do something. It might be complicated, but there is opportunity for public comment to give us better ideas. Thus far, we had a hearing up in New York City in July, and opinions are all over the map as to how to handle this from the public safety perspective and from the private industry perspective. So there's no critical mass behind a particular idea, and it's going to be hard to do. But we need to do something. So I commend the chairman for doing it, and we're going to vote on something on September 25th at our next open meeting.
Commissioner, a Republican-controlled FCC, and you're a Republican, has barraged the cable industry with regulation over the last 4 years, leading to something like 11 individual federal lawsuits. Are you happy with that record?
No, I'm not. And Ted, as you probably know, I've dissented from many of those proceedings. My concern is, I tend to be a free market fellow. I tend to be an optimist. And I think cable has actually led the way in broadband penetration. And now we're seeing opportunities for the creation of more delivery platforms in broadband. And we're trying to have more competition against cable in fiber and in wireless especially. But I've made clear in some of my dissents that on some of those matters that you're referring to, that was not the right way to go. The Commission should have gone in a different direction on some of those.
Well, let's take that a little further, Commissioner McDowell. First of all, when you talk about network management, do you call it network management? Do you call it network neutrality? What's the term that you use?
Well, you put your finger right on it, that there are different terms, and there really are no standard definitions for these terms. And so net neutrality is what I call a Rorschach term. It depends on where you sit and how you interpret that term. It's going to mean something different for you. Network management probably has a slightly different connotation. And what we saw on August the 1st was for the first time the U.S. government stepping in my view, to try to supplant the role of engineers in network management.
This is the Comcast decision.
This is the Comcast BitTorrent matter, which I dissented from. And first of all, we don't know what Comcast did or did not do because the FCC did not conduct its own investigation. We relied simply on what are apparently the unsigned declarations of 3 individuals versus signed declarations from one other individual, and then boxes and boxes of opinion based on that evidence. But if this were a court of law, the evidence would have been very, very scant. I think a court of law would have thrown the case out of court. And I think a court will probably throw this out as well for a variety of legal and procedural problems. But more importantly, the Internet is the biggest deregulatory success story of all time. And network management issues have always been resolved by collaborative private sector groups such as the Internet Engineering Task Force, or groups under the umbrella of the Internet Society or the Internet Architecture Board and others. And they have working groups of academics, software developers, network owners, folks acting in their individual capacities, not in the capacities of their employers, to resolve these issues in terms of network congestion and things of that nature. And it has worked. And my concern with what we did on August the 1st, or what the Commission did on August the 1st, and I dissented, was that the government now is taking on that role. And just real quickly, if you look throughout the world, societies that regulate the Internet more tend to be less democratic. Societies that regulate the Internet less tend to be more democratic. So what we're doing is subjecting Internet regulation and network management regulation to the whims of elections, so that every 2 to 4 years you could have a different set of policies, rather than letting engineers solve engineering problems.
Right, but in terms of process, is what happened here an instance where the FCC was handing out speeding tickets to Comcast before telling anybody what the speed limit is?
Yeah, and that's a very good point. We could actually take up the whole half hour here talking just about this one proceeding. I'm sure you don't want to do that. But another procedural concern was the FCC did not have rules to enforce on this matter that was brought before us. So I talked about the evidentiary problems, but procedurally and substantively, there were no rules. The FCC in the summer of 2005 came out with some net neutrality guidelines, some principles, but two of my colleagues, whom I respect greatly, at the time in 2005 said those were not enforceable rules, and then reversed themselves on August the 1st to say that they were enforceable rules. And this will be a big problem on appeal. Did not go through the normal notice, public comment process for rules. So you're absolutely right. We put the cart before the horse. It's better, I think, to generate rules and then enforce them rather than try to create rules through enforcement.
Well, since we've moved into the broadband area, I wanted to ask you this. There's a notion or an idea spreading that the United States lags other countries in terms of broadband deployment and speeds. My question is, what can the United States government do to improve broadband here that the market isn't already supplying?
Well, first of all, there's a debate regarding some of those studies. The most famous of the studies is the OECD study that shows that we might be currently 15th in the world, or within the OECD, in terms of broadband penetration. The OECD looks at broadband subscribers per capita, per person in a country, versus per household. The United States tends to have larger household sizes than folks in, let's say, Europe or Asia. And that puts us at a statistical disadvantage. In fact, there's one study that showed if all of the OECD countries were completely broadband saturated, where 100% of all the homes and businesses were connected to the internet with a broadband pipe, we would be 20th. So it would be impossible for us to move up in those rankings because we have larger household sizes. And if you look at some of our states individually and compare them to countries, if you look at New Jersey, for instance, which is roughly the same size as South Korea, it actually has a higher household adoption rate than does Korea. Alaska is more broadband saturated than France under that analysis. Now, having said all that, that doesn't mean everything's perfect. We need to do more. But if you've looked at the past few years, the acceleration of our broadband penetration has been increasing speed. We've gone from 20% growth rate of adoption to 30, 40, 50, over 60% growth rates for broadband adoption. And that's while at the same time we've been busy pursuant to a Supreme Court opinion, of putting broadband services into a less regulated regulatory bucket than they were in before.
I guess my point is, can you think of a single thing the federal government can do to improve broadband in this country, however defined, that would satisfy critics who think that American broadband is inferior?
And on top of that, what do you think of Chairman Martin's proposal that he made a few weeks back, kind of a public-private partnership to make broadband national?
I think you're referring to the wireless free broadband. Is that what you're referring to? Okay. So first of all, back to Ted's question, which is there are areas of the country that don't have broadband. We are examining, or will be examining later this fall, revamping of our universal service subsidy program. But in the meantime, there are public-private partnerships sprouting up throughout the country, the first, most famous of which was Connect Kentucky, where the government might provide seed money or regulatory relief or other such incentives for private corporations to come in and wire up rural America or areas that are left to fall between the cracks here. So first of all, I welcome the critics. I think we need to be critical of ourselves because broadband is an ever-expanding, ever-changing term, and we need fatter and faster pipes throughout the country, and everyone should have access to it.
But when you say that there are areas of this country that don't have broadband, you are excluding satellite-delivered broadband provided by HughesNet and WildBlue. When you're referring to whether or not communities have access to broadband provided by a wireline system.
Terrestrially, that's right. And satellite broadband is limited in its bandwidth in terms of its speeds, but it is an alternative if you're out in the country. Now, our 700 megahertz auction, which we referred to before, is actually hopefully a solution to that. Signals in some areas can travel 20 or 30 miles, and that over the horizon, I'm very bullish, very optimistic about our broadband competitiveness. Now, back to the free wireless proposal, as it's known. There's the potential for an auction in another part of the spectrum called the 2.1 gigahertz space. And we are undergoing, the FCC is undergoing some testing right now to see if use within that frequency band would interfere with the licensees in an auction we just conducted 2 years ago called the Advanced Wireless Services Roman numeral 1 auction in August of 2006. So we're undergoing testing right now to see if there's interference, and we'll see where that proposal goes.
Is there a role for government?
In what aspect?
In providing wireless or terrestrial broadband nationwide?
Well, there are a lot of local governments have provided free Wi-Fi, municipal Wi-Fi, etc., and that's an issue, I think, for local governments. Unless Congress preempts them, and then that's an issue for Congress.
Well, we've been talking a lot of issues here, and
yes.
Just philosophically, is the FCC set up in its current state to manage a lot of these new issues that nobody knew were coming 10, 20 years ago?
Well, you raise a good point, which is technology and the marketplace are racing far past government. And to go back to that Comcast BitTorrent matter, if the government is going to try to manage engineering decisions over the internet, it's incapable of responding in the nanoseconds that comprise internet time. We just can't do it. So we want to make sure that government does not get in the way of progress. At the same time, it's government's role to focus on market failure or bottlenecks where there might be an opportunity for some corporations, some players in the market to frustrate the rollout of new technologies and maybe frustrate consumer demand as well. So our job is to look at that and try to address that.
Commissioner McDowell, before you sat down, Ted Hearn and I were talking, and we were kind of working, we were talking politics and the FCC. Ted, if you would briefly describe the scenario that we were talking about before Commissioner McDowell sat down and get his response to that.
Well, to get right to the bottom line, is it possible that come January or February that you could be FCC chairman with two Democrats? With two Democrats, so that would make the FCC a Democratic majority under Republican chairman.
I'm sort of the accidental commissioner. This is not a job I ever pursued. I actually got a phone call at 7:15 p.m. I remember exactly when it was, on the night of Monday night, November the 7th, 2005, with someone asking me if I wanted to be an FCC commissioner, and I said, gosh, let me talk to my wife and I'll get right back to you. And they said, no, we need an answer right now. So I had to answer before I told my wife. And I will be forever indebted to her as a result. So when I signed on for this, I fully expected to serve as the sort of accidental commissioner until my term ends June 30 of 2009. That would be a 37-month term. So beyond that, it's speculation as to who's going to win an election and what personnel decisions they might make.
What would you foresee in a John McCain administration when it comes to telecommunications policy? Very little in the Republican platform on telecom policy. There is talk of free internet. et cetera. But what would you foresee in a McCain administration?
Well, first of all, I don't speak for the McCain campaign. I'm not here as a surrogate for him, so I know as much probably about it as you do. I think we can look at his record. He trusts in free markets. He shares the belief that the government is incapable of making the billions of independent decisions that are made in the private sector each day, and that we should search only for those areas where there's market failure or some sort of market power that's perhaps holding back innovation and benefits to consumers. So I think that would be, broadly speaking, a philosophy he would work from.
Getting back to spectrum policy, I wanted to ask you this. How long can TV stations in this country expect to hang on to their spectrum when pay TV penetration is approaching 90%? Just who exactly are they broadcasting to, and how can they hang on to this spectrum when there are wireless companies who have mobile users who are panting to get their hands on this spectrum?
It's an excellent point, and actually the marketplace is very exciting right now because it's changing so rapidly. ComScore, which is an independent data research firm, estimates that there last month were over 12 billion video downloads off of the internet just in 1 month in America. And that number is growing by leaps and bounds. I think a year ago it was closer to 9 billion or maybe even 8 billion. And so what does that mean? That means more and more Americans are pulling their video content. They're working around the cable companies, they're working around the broadcasters, they're going right to the source. NBC had a huge experiment with the Olympics here last month, and we're getting some preliminary numbers from them, but they had over 20 million unique visitors a day sometimes visiting their website to watch the Olympics online. CBS, the same thing with the NCAAs. To watch the basketball tournament, March Madness. So I think this is wonderfully powerful. It's powerful, positive, constructive market disruption. Consumers want to be able to pull the content of their choice wherever and whenever they want. And I think cable operators and broadcasters are going to face a lot of stress and a lot of big decisions here coming up. It's basically a market-driven, a la carte world.
But do you see a need for the FCC to study how it would be possible to migrate TV stations over to paid TV platforms where the vast majority of consumers are watching them in order to free up that spectrum for other uses, mainly mobile uses and rather static one-way broadcasting?
Well, of course, with the DTV transition, we're in part doing that. Broadcasters are going to be more efficient now in their use of the spectrum. Remember before I said analog used to take up this much spectrum, now digital takes up this much, and we've auctioned off the balance. So we've already seen moves by Congress and the FCC to do just that. I think there's probably a lot of spectrum out there. I think we're just entering what I call the golden age of wireless because our spectral efficiency, that's how efficient we are in our use of the spectrum, that efficiency doubles every 2.5 years, and the cost is cut in half every 46 months in terms of the cost. It's sort of tied to Moore's law in computing. And your cell phone today, even the simplest of cell phones, has more computing power in it than the entire Apollo program did to put men on the moon. So these are absolutely astounding. These trends will continue throughout our lifetimes, and I think it's going to be wonderful and unimaginable what technologies are over the horizon.
Commissioner McDowell, in referring to the internet, you said it was a market-driven, a la carte world.
I thought you might have picked up on that.
When it comes to a la carte and cable, are you a supporter of that? And do you see that as a reoccurring issue in the future for the FCC?
I think it might be a reoccurring issue for maybe the Congress and the FCC to talk about, but because I believe it is a market-driven a la carte world, I don't see the need for a government mandate. In fact, a government mandate could have the opposite effect of what is advertised. There are a lot of studies out there, private studies, independent studies, and government studies that show that it would not lower prices for consumers, it would actually raise prices. It would not increase their choice of channels, it would actually decrease because a lot of niche channels would go out of business. Fewer folks would watch it. And if you and yes, people have their top 10 or 15 cable channels that they watch, but people also like to browse cable channels. Some like to browse C-SPAN. If we were to ask the majority of Americans what are their top 10 or 15 channels, for some, C-SPAN may be on that top 10 or 15. For others, it might not. during an election year, they might be really glad they have C-SPAN so they can watch political conventions directly, like I did on C-SPAN. But other times of the year and other cycles, they might watch C-SPAN less, just as an example. So it could have a real adverse effect and actually do the opposite of what's advertised.
FCC Chairman Kevin Martin, a Republican, likes to say that the cable industry forces people to buy programming. Do you agree? Is anyone in the United States forced to buy cable television?
There's a couple issues there. There's the retail aspect of whether cable television forces the end user consumer to buy its services, and I don't know anyone who's forced to buy cable TV. Then there's the issue of whether or not programmers are forcing cable operators to buy programming in certain kinds of blocks. But back to the point I made about those 12 billion video downloads each month, I think that's going to is already, but is going to even more disrupt the market there and start to drive down the cost of programming because you can get it for free on the internet.
Mm-hmm. And finally, Commissioner McDowell, the Democratic platform this year. One of the points in the platform says that they will clarify the public interest obligations of broadcasters who occupy the nation's spectrum. What does that say to you?
Well, we have, late last year, a notice of proposed rulemaking, the only notice of proposed rulemaking I've dissented from, and these are proposed rules, these aren't adopting final rules, on what's called localism. And the premise is that broadcasters have more power today than they've ever had before and are under-regulated. And I disagree with that premise for the same reasons I've been explaining with the plethora of choices out there for consumers. You know, we now operate under the acronym of TMI, which is too much information. We're overwhelmed by information from a variety of sources, more sources than when these old broadcast regulations were on broadcasters. So I think broadcasters actually have less power. They have more of an incentive to differentiate their product than ever before because of things like the internet or satellite TV or satellite radio, for instance. And they have an incentive to become more local oriented in their program than ever before. So my concern is, and by the way, top line revenue for broadcasters is declining. The eyeballs and ears are going elsewhere, and the ad dollars are following those eyeballs and ears elsewhere, away from broadcasters. So do we really want to hand a drowning person a big rock in the form of more government regulation?
Commissioner Robert McDowell, FCC, thank you for being on the Communicators.
Thanks for
Ted
having me
Hearn
back.
of Multichannel News, thank you.
Thanks, Peter.